Well, a major news publication has just found out some ground-shaking, ground-shattering news for gun owners everywhere. They took in a 50 BMG to an indoor range, they strapped on some sensors, and they found out that there's shock waves that come from these guns. In other breaking news, they found out water is wet and hurricanes are actually windy. Now, of course, I'm being a little sarcastic here because we're going to break down what I think is agenda that the New York Times is trying to portray with their groundbreaking evidence that found that indoor gun ranges are actually dangerous to gun owners. And so we're going to break down the facts about indoor gun ranges versus the agenda I think the New York Times is actually trying to portray. I'd love to get your opinion on this. Have you ever had some brainwave concussion type of experience when you went to an indoor range? Or do you think this is a bunch of baloney from the New York Times once again? I'm going to give you my opinion. Let me know yours down below. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So here's what the New York Times did. They sent some people that have previous military experience to an indoor range. They strapped on sensors to test what kind of PSI they are getting when you actually fire a gun, okay? And so what they did is they took, a 9mm, they would take an AR, they would take some other popular guns and measure that pressure that's coming back towards the shooter. And they found that most guns are actually like 1 PSI to 1.8 PSI. Then they took a 50 BMG and tested that at the indoor range and found that that gun actually exerted 7.6 PSI back to the shooter. They actually put like this, silk sheet behind the shooter to show the blast waves kind of coming back. They're kind of reporting on what we already know. If you have hard surfaces, you have that initial concussive blast, right? It's going to bounce off the walls of an indoor range, and it is then going to exert a little bit of pressure on the shooter himself. Now, the first thing I found with this that was interesting is I don't know how many people are taking a 50 BMG to an indoor range, but I would guess it's not many actually. I know that many ranges aren't going to allow a 50 BMG at an indoor range anyways, and most people want to actually utilize that gun at long distances, not at 25 yards in an indoor range. Now essentially what they're using is the Army standard. So the Army standard says that anything below 4 PSI exerted on a shooter should be relatively safe. The first problem there though is that the Army wasn't really testing like if that PSI would have damaging effects to the brain, which is kind of the claim that New York Times is making. They're not saying that it necessarily does, but they're saying there needs to be more research, along with a lot of other things actually in this agenda piece, if you will. But they're using the Army standard of 4 PSI, but when the Army did that testing, they were trying to see what kind of damage shooters would have to their eardrums, not the damage that could potentially be imposed on shooters' brains. The other thing you should know is that this isn't like a peer-reviewed type of test. These are journalists, right, and videographers that are not gathering statistics. There's no real sample size here. They're just taking a few different types of guns, going to the absolute extreme with it as well with a 50 BMG, and saying that this could have effects on shooters over time. And there's like some legislative things thrown into this study as well. Here's what's interesting though, is it's not just like the PSI that you're actually feeling. We're talking about the impulse. And so the military is actually already doing tests on low-level blasts and the cumulative impulse that a lot of people will feel. So if you look at like range instructors, right, people that actually shoot for a living. If you look at people in the military that, are heavy weapon operators, breachers, and people that are constantly dealing with that low-level blast, that cumulative impulse actually, then over time, there have been shown, at least in some rat studies or, lab studies, that essentially there can be biomarkers, there can be like cognitive, effects, maybe some behavioral changes. but that's a far cry away from like having a concussion or some traumatic brain injury over time. Those statistics are not even close to being confirmed at all. So the headline, indoor ranges or shooters can suffer traumatic brain injuries from being at an indoor range is far from the truth. First of all, there's no real measure either, right? So the highest peak in PSI isn't a real measure. Like I said, it's that cumulative impulse over time. That's a very important thing. So what this means to pretty much everybody is this is highly dependent on how often you shoot, where you shoot, right? If it's a outdoor range, well, obviously you're not going to have as much blast. You're not going to have the concussion from the gun specifically bouncing all around you. And look, I've gone to an indoor range before and got a bad headache because it's just way too much going on. So that I don't doubt. And if you're shooting in an environment like that every single day, day in, day out, then maybe down the line they will show that there's some kind of effects it can have on you, but does that necessarily mean that you're going to get TBI or something like that, like a football player would, right, that gets concussions over and over and over? No, absolutely not. There's no evidence to point to that. So it's something to watch over time. But again, people have been shooting at indoor ranges for a really, really long time. Tens of thousands, if not more, people go to indoor ranges more often than outdoor ranges, at least, in the area I live. I mean, indoor ranges are pretty much everywhere. Outdoor ranges are a lot harder to find. That's not even the worst part of this article. I would say some of the other things, some of the other claims they make are worse. Like, okay, suppressors, right? What does a suppressor do? Well, obviously, it lowers the decibel rating, which is fantastic, right? That saves shooters' ears, right? If you care about shooters really, then you would think in this article they would be all for that. But hold on a minute. They say, oh, this only slightly helps. But what it also does is actually lessens the blast that a shooter would feel, which hence lessens the impulses they would feel, makes it safer for them as well. But what they say is, oh, well, suppressors are restricted, and they really don't make that big of a difference anyways, which is a complete line of BS. Here's the other thing. By this own article's admission and their own testing, they're showing that the most common guns used at an indoor range, which would be the AR and 5.56 or 223, and then 9mm pistols, things like that, are going to have a PSI rating if we were to go off of that alone, which, like I just said, you can't. But if we were to go off of that alone, those numbers are well below the 4 PSI that the Army has set forward, and even Canada, which is more conservative in their numbers, of course, but they say under 3 PSI is technically safe. But what they do is they consistently say in this article, we don't have a safety threshold, and yet they present this testing that they did as almost like an unsafe threshold. And so they're kind of tracking into the territory of almost legislation, not as a way to show real harm caused to shooters over time. So this article doesn't take into account low-level blasts over time. It doesn't take into account indoor versus outdoor ranges. By the way, the NSSF has 52.7 million shooters, right, in the United States, right? You have tens of thousands of indoor ranges. At this point, you would think there would be some kind of clinical data somewhere that would say, hey, shooting at an indoor range really does increase your chances by a lot. Yet we don't have that. The sport to some, but the lifestyle to others of shooting in self-defense has only grown, even at indoor ranges. That's the data we should be looking at, taking these shooters every single week and actually looking at, what kind of effects they potentially have, right? Do you just have a headache and it kind of goes away after you get out of the range for a little while? Because one of the guys in this article said it took him a long time after visiting an indoor range to even like lift his arm and look at his watch, and it took him a long time to get his range bag back together and all, almost like he was having a traumatic brain type of injury. Now, that's not to say that, there's not any risk associated. Again, but volume matters. Where you shoot matters, what you shoot matters, and how often. All of that stuff plays into this. Here's the thing, right? Maybe indoor ranges could do a better job of ventilation, right? There's obviously going to be noise complaints, right? There's outdoor ranges that I've talked to that constantly deal with noise complaints. Even though they're protected, at least in the state of South Carolina, and I think this goes pretty much everywhere, gun ranges are a protected entity, but they still deal with it. That doesn't mean that ventilation can't be improved in the gun ranges. It's not the guns. The guns aren't causing brain damage. Maybe the ranges themselves actually need to account for this and make it a more comfortable and better experience if they can. So go outdoors whenever you can. Use suppressors whenever you can. If you get a headache when you shoot, well, just remember that doesn't mean it's a brain injury, because people that wear PPE all day report headaches. People that run power tools, mechanics, people that go to concerts report having headaches afterwards, right? That's just like a symptom, not a diagnosis of anything severe going on. And if you really want to help shooters, help us in getting the NFA or suppressors removed off the NFA entirely, and then we'll take care of the rest and completely eliminate the NFA. But that's a start. Those definitely have a lot of benefits to shooters if the New York Times really cares about shooters and their health. Improving indoor ranges like we talked about. Not trying to stigmatize the sport in a kind of weird way that's disguised behind some kind of scientific study when in reality it's not. That's just my opinion, though. I'd love to hear yours. Let me know what kind of range you shoot at. What is the environment like? Do you ever notice anything strange after you get out of an indoor range after an extended period of time? Let me know your opinion down below. If you like what I do, consider subscribing. See you in the next one. And as always, hold them down.